This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we open a file that was never meant to be found. Hidden in the wooded folds of Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley, there once existed a community that time forgot. A place so poor, so isolated, and so untouched by the world beyond its trees that it became something else entirely, a pocket of humanity that began to decay in silence. The people who lived there were known as the Goler family, and for over a century, they remained unseen, unchallenged, and unrescued. To reach their homes, you would drive hours from Halifax, then turn off the paved road and follow a twisting dirt track into the woods. No street signs, no mailboxes. Only the sound of gravel under tires and the slow realization that you were driving out of modernity and into a forgotten past. The Golers had lived on South Mountain for generations. Their roots went back to the late 1800s, when settlers first cut through the forest and built small farms along the rocky slopes. But as the decades passed, the soil thinned, the crops failed, and the world beyond the mountain began to move on without them. Factories opened in the cities, schools spread through the towns. But not here. Here, the farms withered, the jobs vanished, and what little connection they had to the outside world faded away. By the 1950s, many of the families in that valley had fallen into deep poverty. The Goler family, large, sprawling, interwoven, survived on welfare, scrap work, and barter. Electricity was rare. Running water was a luxury they had never known. They hunted, trapped, and scrounged for survival. The world saw them as invisible, and over time, they became invisible even to themselves. For the children born there, the mountain was the whole world. There were no televisions, no schools, no visitors. No teachers to ask questions, no police to check in, no neighbors to speak of. The forest was both their home and their prison. Generations passed, and the family grew dozens of children, then grandchildren, all living within a few collapsing shacks built from wood and rusted tin. They depended on one another completely, and in that dependence, something terrible took root. In 1984, a teenage girl walked barefoot down the mountain road. She was 16. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her body thin. She carried nothing, no bag, no coat, just the quiet determination of someone who had decided she would rather die than go back. When she reached the small town below, she went to the police station and asked to speak to someone alone. Her voice trembled as she spoke. She told them about the mountain, about her family, about what was being done to her and to the other children. She said that no one was safe up there, not the girls, not even the little ones. The officers didn't know what to make of it. Stories like that didn't happen in Canada, or so they believed. But the girl's words didn't change, and the look in her eyes didn't fade. So they drove up the mountain to see for themselves. What they found was not a home, but a place left behind by civilization. The houses were barely standing walls of patched wood and cardboard, windows broken, roofs sagging under the weight of rot. Inside, there was almost nothing. No furniture, no clean clothes, no food in the cupboards. The smell of filth and decay filled the rooms, and everywhere children. Dozens of them. Dirty, underfed, dressed in rags. Their faces blank, their eyes cautious. They did not speak when spoken to. Some hid behind the walls. Some simply stared. When asked who their parents were, many could not answer. When asked how old they were, most didn't know. The adults hovered nearby, watching the police with silent suspicion. They didn't ask why the officers were there. They didn't seem to understand. The girl's story was true, and worse than anyone had imagined. When the investigation began, it uncovered something almost beyond comprehension. The entire Goler Clan, brothers, sisters, uncles, cousins, had been living in a cycle of sexual abuse and inbreeding for decades. The children had been assaulted by their fathers, grandfathers, uncles, and brothers. The older girls, once victims, had been forced into silence. And when they grew older, they too were violated or became mothers to children whose fathers they could not name. Police reports described it as a community with no clear moral structure. But those words were too clean, too small for what was found. The Golers had lived so long without contact with the outside world that right and wrong had ceased to exist. Survival was the only rule. The investigators found a pattern of abuse that stretched back generations. Children born of incest, growing into adults who repeated what had been done to them. And because there was no one from outside to intervene, no teachers, no doctors, no law, the cycle never broke. Neighbors from nearby valleys admitted that they knew of the Golers, but had stayed away. Some had heard rumors, whispers about strange things happening in those woods. But the Golers were poor, and poor people were often shamed for what they couldn't change. It was easier to pretend the mountain didn't exist. It would take months for the police to gather statements. The girl's story opened the door, but every interview that followed revealed new layers of horror. Children described things they thought were normal acts of violence that had no meaning to them. They had grown up believing that everyone's childhood was like theirs. The truth hit the investigators slowly, piece by piece. This was not a single act of crime. It was an entire world built on silence. By the time the arrests began, the RCMP had identified more than a dozen adults directly involved in the assaults: fathers, uncles, cousins. In total, about 70 people were part of the extended family network. Some were victims, some were perpetrators, many were both. When the first news reports appeared, Canada was stunned. The idea that such a thing could happen within a modern, developed nation seemed impossible. Oh, but the evidence was undeniable. The courts moved quickly. The Crown prosecutors assembled a case that would become one of the largest incest and sexual abuse trials in Canadian history. Reporters filled the courtroom. The nation wanted to know, how could this have happened for so long without anyone stopping it? When the accused were brought in, most of them looked bewildered, not angry, not defiant, just confused. They didn't understand why they were being punished. In their world, there had never been a line to cross. What they had done wasn't rebellion, it was tradition. And that was what made it terrifying. The trials began in the spring of 1985. Inside the small courthouse in Kentville, Nova Scotia, journalists crowded shoulder to shoulder, their notepads ready, their faces pale. They had read the police files, but reading and hearing were not the same. When the victims entered the courtroom, the air itself changed quiet, thick, almost sacred in its heaviness. One by one, the children took the stand. They were small, fragile, many of them barely teenagers. Their voices trembled as they answered questions they barely understood. They were asked to describe things no child should know. And they did softly, plainly without tears, because to them it was not a secret. It was simply life. Some spoke about fathers who climbed into their beds at night. Some about uncles and cousins who lined up outside doors. One child said she thought it was what families do. The jurors wept openly. Even the court stenographer paused her typing more than once, unable to continue. The accused sat only a few feet away, expressionless. They didn't interrupt, didn't deny, didn't seem to understand. When asked if they knew what they'd done was wrong, most shook their heads. A few said they had been raised the same way, and that was true. Generations of isolation had turned abuse into inheritance. Psychologists would later describe it as a closed cultural loop, a world without outside moral reference, where wrong and right had blurred until nothing was left but instinct. The Golers had become a living experiment in what happens when poverty, ignorance, and neglect are allowed to fester for too long without intervention. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses teachers who had once visited the area, social workers who admitted to ignoring earlier warnings, doctors who had seen signs but failed to report them. Each testimony exposed not only what the Golers had done, but what the system had failed to do. One social worker confessed that she had filed reports years earlier, but that they were dismissed as poverty cases. No one wanted to go up the mountain. The road was too rough, the people too strange, the work too unpleasant. And so the reports piled up in filing cabinets, forgotten. When the defense spoke, their words shocked the courtroom in another way. So, they didn't deny the crimes, they explained them. Their clients, they argued, were not monsters, but victims themselves, shaped by decades of isolation. They had never been taught what consent was, or why what they did was wrong. The lawyers didn't ask for sympathy. They asked for understanding. The judge listened carefully. He had seen crimes of passion, of greed, of anger, but never of ignorance this deep. When the sentences were handed down, 14 adults were convicted on charges ranging from incest to sexual assault. The longest sentences were 15 years, the shortest just under 5. Yet, none of them understood the meaning of the numbers read to them in court. When the verdicts were announced, the journalists wrote that the courtroom fell into a silence like mourning. It wasn't a victory. It was grief. Grief for the victims, grief for the years lost, grief for what the country had allowed to happen in its own forgotten corner. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. The world finally looked toward South Mountain. But what it saw wasn't a family. It was a failure of compassion, a failure of awareness, a failure of an entire system designed to protect the innocent. In the weeks that followed, the children were removed from the mountain and placed into foster homes. Some were taken in by families who wanted to help. Others were sent to institutions that could manage trauma and behavioral issues. But healing is not a thing that can be scheduled. It happens slowly, unevenly, sometimes not at all. The reports from social workers during those first months paint a haunting picture. Children waking at night screaming. In Chinatown, children hoarding food under their beds. Children afraid of closed doors. When asked to draw pictures of their homes, they drew shacks surrounded by trees, and always, without fail, a figure standing in the doorway, watching. Many of them had never used a toilet. Some didn't know how to use utensils. When taken to stores, they froze at the sight of rows and rows of food, unsure what to do. The modern world, with its colors and movement, overwhelmed them. Teachers tried to educate them, but the language barrier was more than words. It was reality itself. They didn't know the difference between right and wrong, not because they didn't care, but because they had never been taught that the difference existed. Over time, a few began to adapt. One girl learned to read by age 14 and told her teacher that books were like talking to people who don't hurt you. Another boy became fascinated by electricity. He would sit for hours staring at light bulbs, trying to understand how they worked, and small victories in a landscape of ruin. Meanwhile, sociologists descended upon the case, determined to understand how such isolation could persist in a country that called itself civilized. They found that South Mountain was not unique. Across rural Canada in the Maritimes, in northern Quebec, in small indigenous reserves, poverty and isolation had created similar environments where neglect and silence bred suffering. The Goler case was simply the one that had been caught. Reporters from Toronto and Montreal arrived, eager to turn the story into a symbol. They described it as Canada's shame, a wound the nation had ignored. Editorials questioned how a modern government could allow an entire population to fall into darkness. But after the outrage faded, so did the attention. The news cycle moved on. The mountain stayed the same. For those who remained there, life went quiet again. The abandoned shacks fell apart, roofs caving under snow, walls rotting into the soil. Nature began to reclaim what humanity had broken. But beneath the ground, the old memories lingered like roots that refused to die. In interviews years later, surviving children, now adults, tried to make sense of it. Some refused to speak at all. Others described their lives with an unsettling calm. "I don't remember much," one man said, "only the woods and the dark." A woman, interviewed anonymously, said that what haunted her most wasn't the abuse itself, but the silence that surrounded it. "No one ever came for us," she said. "We waited for years. Nobody came." That single sentence became the heart of every book, every documentary, every lecture that followed. It wasn't the cruelty alone that destroyed the Goler children, it was the world's indifference. The case forced Canada to re-examine its social safety net. New laws were written, protocols updated. Teachers were required to report suspected abuse immediately. Social workers were retrained to recognize the difference between poverty and danger. But reforms made on paper could not erase what had already happened. The Goler children grew up carrying two kinds of scars, the ones they could name and the ones they couldn't. The trauma was cellular, woven into their memories, their behavior, their bloodlines. Many struggled with addiction, anxiety, or depression. Some managed to build new lives, start families, even find love. But all of them, in one way or another, remained haunted by the mountain that had raised them. For the rest of Canada, the Goler case faded into history, a dark story remembered in whispers, in criminology lectures, in the margins of textbooks. But for those who lived it, it never truly ended. Some nights, when the fog drifts through the valley, the old locals say the place still feels different, quieter than it should be, as though the trees remember what the people want to forget. The houses are gone. The people have scattered. But silence has a long memory. Years passed after the trials, but the name Goler never disappeared. It lingered like a ghost in the quiet corners of Nova Scotia, whispered in schools, printed in textbooks, and studied in classrooms far from the mountain where it began. For those who lived through it, the story was not history. It was memory raw, heavy, and unending. In the early 1990s, researchers and psychologists began to document the case in full. They wanted to understand not only what had happened, but how it could have lasted so long. To them, the Goler Clan wasn't just a tragedy, it was a question, one that pointed back at the society that had ignored them. They found that South Mountain had once been home to a larger network of rural families, each isolated in pockets of poverty. Most of these families lived quietly, surviving through small farms and odd jobs. But as the decades passed and industry left the region, those families fell into decline. The roads eroded. schools closed. And slowly, the outside world stopped visiting. Government records showed that social workers had driven past the valley for years. They had seen the shacks. They had met the people. Not the sad team, but they called it the rural poor problem, a phrase that turned suffering into an abstraction. To visit, to intervene, to help that took money, time, and courage. It was easier to forget. By the time anyone truly looked, it was already too late. The psychologists studying the surviving children published their findings in thick, technical papers. The words were clinical: intergenerational trauma, moral deprivation, genetic bottleneck. But behind those terms was something profoundly human: the cost of being unseen. One researcher wrote, "The Goler case is not about monsters. It is about the slow erosion of empathy when isolation becomes normal." The studies revealed how decades of inbreeding had not only damaged the body, but the mind. Many of the Golers showed signs of cognitive impairment, reduced IQ, emotional dysregulation, difficulty distinguishing fantasy from truth. But intelligence was only part of it. What the scientists couldn't measure was what had been taken from them: trust, innocence, the understanding of love. When the public first learned of these reports, reactions were divided. Some were horrified, others were defensive. Decay. People didn't want to believe that such decay could exist inside a nation that prided itself on compassion. To accept that the Golers were created by neglect was to admit a collective failure. By the mid-1990s, the Goler case became a fixture in criminology and sociology programs across Canada. Students read about it not as a tale of crime, but as a case study in what happens when poverty becomes invisible. It became a warning, a mirror. In 1996, a journalist revisited the valley for a documentary. He described driving through the same twisting dirt roads, the forest closing in, the air colder than it should be. What he found was not a community, only the remnants of one. A few families still lived there, under different names, but they refused to speak on camera. When asked about the Golers, one man said quietly, "They're gone. Let them stay gone." The houses were collapsing into the soil, tin roofs rusted through. The wind moved through empty windows like breath through ribs. Even the animals avoided the place. The reporter wrote that the silence was so deep it felt like punishment. But not everything disappeared. In the provincial archives, rows of boxes preserved every page of the investigation interviews, photographs, medical records. Inside, one can still read the testimony of children who are now adults, their handwriting shaky, uneven, learning to write for the first time in the foster homes that took them in. On one of the final pages, a girl wrote, "They told me I was safe now. I didn't know what safe meant." Those words became the heart of every academic paper and every moral debate that followed. The Golers were not a story about evil. They were a story about absence, the absence of education, of law, of light. Sociologists later compared the Goler case to similar incidents across the world, from the backwoods of Appalachia to the mountain villages of Eastern Europe. In every case, the pattern was the same: isolation, poverty, ignorance, and silence. A society that does not reach its most remote corners eventually creates its own monsters. In Nova Scotia, the government began quietly increasing funding for rural welfare programs, education, and child protection. But no law, no program could undo what had already been done on that mountain. You cannot legislate away memory, an ode. You cannot heal a wound that was never allowed to close. For the Goler survivors, adulthood brought a strange kind of invisibility. They were both victims and symbols, pitied by strangers, studied by academics, but rarely understood as people. Some moved away, building lives under new names in distant provinces. A few stayed near the valley, unwilling to leave the only home they had ever known. But all of them carried a silence that no therapist could break. When asked in later interviews whether they forgave their parents, many hesitated. One man in his 40s said softly, "It's hard to hate people who didn't know any better." It wasn't forgiveness. It was resignation, a weary understanding that cruelty had been handed down like inheritance. The mountain itself changed with time. Nature has a way of reclaiming what people destroy. The forest grew thick again, swallowing the paths that once led to the shacks. Moss covered the walls, the trees pushed through the roofs, and the wind began to erase the last traces of human life. If you walk there now, you wouldn't know a community ever stood among the trees. Only the earth remembers. In recent years, sociologists have returned to the Goler story as a reminder of how thin the boundary is between civilization and decay. Every society has its forgotten corners, its neglected children, its unspoken shame. The Golers were simply the ones who could no longer hide. One modern researcher summarized it best. The horror of the Goler case lies not in what they did to each other, but in what we allowed to happen by looking away. That sentence has become a warning, whispered in lecture halls and classrooms across Canada. Because the truth is simple and cruel. When a community is abandoned long enough, the light does not simply fade. It curdles. The mountain stands silent now. The trees move softly in the wind. And under the soil lie the ghosts of a family that never understood the world that condemned them. Their story is no longer in the news. But in the stillness of Nova Scotia's woods, if you stand long enough, you can feel it, the weight of history pressing from below, waiting for someone to remember. In the decades that followed the trials, Canada quietly changed. It didn't happen overnight. There were no grand announcements, no memorials. But within the government buildings of Halifax, Ottawa, and every province that had looked away, the lesson of the Goler case settled like dust, heavy, inescapable, and long overdue. Child welfare laws were rewritten. Social services were expanded into the rural regions that had once been forgotten. Every report of abuse, no matter how small, was now required by law to be investigated. New training programs were created for teachers, doctors, and police officers to recognize the signs of neglect that could once hide behind poverty and doubt. It wasn't reform born of idealism. It was reform born of guilt. And yet, even as policies changed, the wound remained. For the people of Nova Scotia, the Goler name became a kind of whispered warning, a reminder that civilization is only as strong as its compassion. It became a taboo, a word spoken rarely, always quietly. On South Mountain, the remaining families stopped using the name altogether. Children grew up being told never to mention it. The past became something you buried, not something you spoke of. In the 2000s, journalists returned once again to the valley. They found new roads, new homes, and in some places, new hope. But the air still felt uneasy. Locals spoke about outsiders with suspicion. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. One old man who lived near the mountain said, "They wrote about us like we were animals. But it wasn't just them. It was the whole country that forgot us." His words carried the truth that still echoes today. The Goler story was not just about what happened in the woods. It was about what didn't happen everywhere else. In the years after the case, Canada began studying the broader effects of long-term poverty and isolation. What they found was that communities left behind tend to decay not in a single generation, but over many. Neglect compounds like interest. A A lack of education becomes a lack of opportunity. A lack of opportunity becomes dependence. And dependence, when left long enough, becomes a prison. The Golers lived in that prison for more than 100 years, with no bars, no guards, and no way out. They weren't hidden from the world. The world simply chose not to look. By the late 2010s, the story of the Goler Clan resurfaced briefly in documentaries and academic journals. Historians saw it as an example of social collapse, how an entire community can regress when cut off from structure and light. The psychologists saw it as an intergenerational experiment in trauma, the way abuse, once normalized, becomes identity. And for Canadians who watched these retellings, it was a reminder of something darker, that evil does not always arrive as a stranger. Sometimes it grows quietly in the spaces we forget to care for. The children of the Goler. Survivors, those who were born after the trials, live scattered across Canada now. Some know the history, some don't. A few have chosen to reclaim their last name, to tell their story on their own terms. They speak not of blame, but of survival. They talk about education, about empathy, about the importance of seeing what others refuse to see. One of them, a woman now in her 40s, said in an interview, "When people hear the name, they think of monsters, but we were just people. We just didn't have anyone to show us how to live." Her words carry the quiet wisdom that so often follows pain. The tragedy is not always born from hatred sometimes. It's born from neglect. The mountain itself has changed little. The trees that once surrounded the shacks now grow thicker, covering what's left of the paths. If you visit today, you won't find ruins or memorials or plaques. The forest has taken everything back. Only the soil remembers. But beneath that earth, in the roots and stones, something lingers, not a haunting, but a warning. Because the Goler story is not just Canadian history. It's a mirror held up to every society that believes its progress is permanent. Eating, civilization is fragile. Aichi-san. It depends on connection, on people watching over one another, caring, teaching, listening. When those bonds break, when the light of knowledge fails to reach the farthest places, the dark fills the gaps. And in those gaps, the human mind, desperate for order, builds its own rules. Rules that forget love. Rules that forget morality. Rules that lead to a world like South Mountain. Iyakt. When the last of the researchers packed their files and the journalists turned off their cameras, the mountain fell silent again. The fog returned, thicker than before, wrapping the valley in the same quiet that had once hidden everything. Now, it is said that silence is peace. But on South Mountain, silence has always meant something else. It means absence. It means forgetting. It means the space where help should have been. Somewhere in a government archive, in a locked box marked confidential case. Files 1984, 1986, there are still photographs of the Goler children. Black and white images. Small faces staring into the camera, with the expression of those who have seen too much. Most are unsmiling. One or two try to. The eyes of those children have become a kind of testimony, the quiet proof that darkness doesn't only exist in war or crime, but in neglect. Every generation since has been told the same thing. We must never let this happen again. But history has a habit of fading when it's uncomfortable. And in that fading, the risk returns. The Goler story is not a tale of villains. It is a chronicle of what happens when empathy dies slowly, when poverty is treated as shame instead of suffering, when isolation becomes inheritance. It is what happens when the world decides that some people are simply too far away to matter. The night remembers what the day forgets. And some stories, once uncovered, should never be buried again. This was Deep Night Whispers. And tonight, the darkness has told us a truth that daylight will always struggle to face. That the worst horrors are not born in shadow. They grow there because no one brought a light.